And welcome to City Club of Central Oregon. Today's virtual forum is Every Vote Does Count, the impact of social movements on our elections. My name's Gwen Weisling. I'm the Executive Director of Bethlehem Inn, and I am honored to serve as the President of the City Club Board. First, I'd like to send out a great appreciation today to our City Club annual sponsors. Without your support, we would not be able to bring you today's programs. Our live stream is also made possible today by Connect Central Oregon. This is a nonprofit launched with the assistance of the OSU Cascades Innovation Collab, and they do a lot of behind-the-scenes work to make this happen as well. Since we are not able to meet in person, those memberships and sponsorships are more critical than ever, really, to City Club sustainability. So thank you to all our members and our sponsors. And for those of you watching today, if you like what you see, please consider becoming a live stream sponsor at $5, $10, or $15 a month, whatever works for you. And as always, if you're wanting to become a member, now's the time. Go to our website, cityclubco.org, to find out more information. With today's forum being about voting, I think we can really understand how this election season may be one of those that is probably the most uncivil that we have known in modern history. Most Americans do agree that we are sick and tired of being so divided. A recent national poll shows that 9 out of 10 said it's important for our country to try and reduce that current polarization. The majority in this poll said that figuring out how to have constructive conversations with folks on the other side is going to go a long way. So with civil discussions always being on the top of the mind for City Club, this year, back in January, we launched the Civility Project. And while January does seem like so long ago, the civility tools still apply. Number 5 on that list is show respect. When you're engaged in dialogue with a person who doesn't share the same viewpoint, recognize that they probably have at least as much information as you do. And when we listen in a respectful way, we really model a more welcoming and receptive behavior. Actively listening also, looking people in the eye and waiting until they finish speaking will go a long ways towards healing any divides. So for a list of those civility tools, you can go and see those on our website. On to our topic for today. Our facilitator is Jamie McLeod-Skinner. Now, Jamie has a lifelong commitment to building healthy, equitable, and resilient communities. An attorney, planner, and small business owner, she has managed the repairs of schools in war-torn countries, designed water systems, mediated community disputes, resettled refugees, managed environmental regulatory reviews for development and natural resource projects. She's facilitated organizational capacity building, established economic development and renewal energy policies, managed a small city, and served on city council. So Jamie has her degrees in civil engineering from Rensselaer Regional Planning from Cornell and law from our University of Oregon, as well as certificates in human rights from Oxford and executive leadership from Harvard. She is now serving as the Jefferson County Educational Service District and membership of the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. Jamie spent a large part of her childhood in East Africa before coming to Oregon, and she and her wife, Cass, have 4 kids and love living here in Central Oregon. So I would like you to all help me in welcoming here today and facilitating today's program.
The health and viability of our democratic republic depends on us choosing leaders. Existence. We have undergone periods of change. And whether you consider the word activism to mean public disruption or a moral obligation to improve your community, of getting into good trouble, we can agree that this is a time of activism and potential change. The intent of this forum is to look at the impact of social movements on elections, on recent elections, both nationally and here in Oregon, and the dynamics that may impact the results in November. Voting is a personal act. It's a statement of our beliefs, our hope for the future, or even our fear of the alternative. Voting is a statement of personal power. By voting, we empower those who represent us and reflect our communities. And that's why every vote does count. Our goal today is to encourage you all to exercise your right to vote. And we have a distinguished panel who will offer their insights on voting from an academic, an administrative, and a personal perspective, and see how that reflects on current election trends. They will provide short presentations, then we'll open it up to your questions. So please type them into the comment section. And I'll begin with some brief biographies. More information is available on the City Club's website. So our first panelist is Dr. Christopher Stout. He's an associate professor at Oregon State University. His research includes race and ethnicity, campaign behavior, political behavior, representation, and political opinion. He's the author of 2 books, The Case for Identity Politics, Polarization, Demographic Change, and Racial Appeals, as well as Bringing Race Back In, Black Politicians, Deracialization, and Voting Behaviors in the Age of Obama. Our second speaker is Nancy Blankenship. Nancy's been the Deschutes County Clerk since 2003, where she's responsible for election administration, recording property transactions, Board of Property Tax Appeals, issuing marriage licenses, processing passports. She processed my son's passport, archiving and record storage, and many more things. She's lived in Central Oregon most of her life and participates in numerous associations and is very strongly invested in our community. And our final panelist is McLeod Parker. McLeod is a Black woman who was born and raised in Bend. She's an avid activist and Director of Public Relations for Central Oregon Black Leaders Assembly, COBLA. She believes that Black, Indigenous, BIPOC communities and younger voters hold power in voting this year, and that everyone must actively participate so that we can have the democracy that we deserve. Thank you all for being here, part of this conversation. And now on with our forum. Dr. Stout, let's begin with your presentation.
Okay. Thank you so much for that introduction, Jamie. Please call me Chris. I will start. Let me make sure I can share this, of course. Okay, so I am once it's set up, I'm going to talk a little about social movements in the United States with a particular focus on Black Lives Matter and the impact that I think it will have on the 2020 presidential election. Before I get into Black Lives Matter, it's important to note that the 2010s have really been a decade of political protests, starting with the Tea Party movement after the election of Barack Obama, which had a large impact on American society, and I think in some ways spurred some of the movements I'll talk a little bit about in a second. The Tea Party movement was able to elect members to government, with the large number of members of Congress being part of the Freedom Caucus being associated with the Tea Party movement. And some say it laid the groundwork for Donald Trump's election to president. And in many ways, the Tea Party worked to polarize America a little bit. They took more extreme positions than the average Republican had taken in the past. One of the consequences of that is then on the other side, there was counter mobilization. And one of the largest counter mobilizations to the Tea Party and the election of Donald Trump was the Women's March. The Women's March started in response to Donald Trump's election to the White House and pushed for addressing gender inequality for members of government. Many women who were elected in the 2018 midterms were inspired by the women's marches of 2017 and 2018. And also the women's marches of 2017 and 2018 were the two largest marches, two largest protests worldwide until the Black Lives Matter, which I'll talk about in a second. Along the same lines, a more recent protest was the March for Our Lives, and this was in response to shootings at high schools, in particular the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida. What's significant about this movement and the Women's March is that both of these movements laid groundwork for or tied to Black Lives Matter, because a lot of the activists that were involved in these movements then went on to work within Black Lives Matter, work with Black Lives Matter's activists. One of the things that's notable is that 1/5 of Americans protested in politics between 2016 and 2018. And one of the movements that happens before the Women's March and before the March for Our Lives is Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter starts as a response to the shooting of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman and his subsequent acquittal. The Black Lives Matter started as a hashtag and then moved to a social movement after really had people on the streets after the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And then that continued over numerous other high-profile shootings of African Americans up to Philando Castile and Alton Sterling in 2016. But after the 2016 election, it kind of went into hiatus. And this is not because police brutality had stopped. In fact, there's some evidence that police brutality remained the same, if not higher, over the 4 years between 2016 and 2020. And it's not that activists had stopped. Activists remained engaged and tried to put focus on what was happening to African Americans, but it wasn't getting much traction. We saw this change at the beginning of 2020 with a couple of high-profile killings of African Americans. First with Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, then with Breonna Taylor in Kentucky, and George Floyd more recently. And George Floyd really was kind of the spark. People had seen videos of Ahmaud Arbery and then seen videos of George Floyd being put on his back with a knee to his neck. And this really inspired more turnout. So the activists were always there. Police brutality hadn't gone away. So the opportunity to really mobilize people around George Floyd and the things that were happening recently was largely successful. And there's a couple of reasons why it happened now, I think in 2020 than in other years. And some have pointed to COVID-19. The fact that COVID-19 had people at home made people more aware of what was happening. So videos of killings of African Americans weren't in short supply. People could find them at any point that they wanted. But COVID-19 kind of forced people to stay at home. And so then they were seeing this again. And what they had thought was corrected or ended after the initial Black Lives Matter movement in 2016, seeing more images of this made them realize this wasn't over. This is still occurring. And this led people to come out and go get out and protest. And so what happened with Black Lives Matter protests? Black Lives Matter protests have estimated that they were the largest in US history. So before this, the Women's March of 2017 was the largest, then the Women's March of 2018, and now it's Black Lives Matter protests. As many as 1 in 10 Americans may have protested in a Black Lives Matter protest. And so that's a pretty significant number to see people active, right? So there's a lot of cost to protesting in terms of time, in terms of organization, and to see that 1 in 10 Americans were involved is pretty incredible. There were 4,700 individual demonstrations that occurred between May 26th and July 3rd. So this data has not been updated because it also has increased since this period of time. There's a couple things that were unique about these protests, not just the large scale of them, but that they occurred outside of the United States. So the African-American experience is unique to the context of the United States, but you saw people internationally protesting in support of Black Lives Matter. The other thing that was really unique about the Black Lives Matter protests is that they were occurring in primarily white counties. And so this wasn't necessarily the case in 2015 and 2016 when you had the initial Black Lives Matter movement. And so you saw this was not just a problem that African Americans cared about. It was a problem that most Americans cared about. And there were numerous public opinion polls that came out during this period of time, which showed large scale support for Black Lives Matter. And the movement has been pretty successful in changing the narrative around race and changing American society in numerous ways. First, there were a number of African Americans elected to federal and local offices, or will be after winning primaries that they unexpectedly won, that people associate with the movement. The other thing that's really significant is that there's been increased discussions about racial inequality. And so here's on the side here, I have a Pew poll taken in June. So this is around right after George Floyd, asking Americans, have you talked about racial inequality in the last month? And you can see that almost 70% of Americans, 7 in 10, say that they had conversations about race. So the Black Lives Matter movement made these tragedies into important moments in changing American society. And so people talked about racial inequality more than they had in the past. And this is significant because addressing racial inequality is really the first step. Talking about racial inequality is the first step to actually getting something done. And it wasn't just the public that was more likely to talk about it. You saw numerous elected officials come out in support of Black Lives Matter. I've done some initial analysis comparing discussions of Black Lives Matter amongst elected officials in 2015 and 2016 to 2020. And there were significantly more members of Congress talking about Black Lives Matter in 2020. And it wasn't just Democrats. Both Democrats and Republicans were saying something about Black Lives Matter. In 2015 and 2016, this was not the case. There was also a larger racial gap where African-American elected officials were more likely to talk about it in 2015 and 2016. But in 2020, it seems like a more universal discussion. The other thing that the movement has been successful is actually leading to policy changes. We saw numerous cities ban chokeholds. We saw cities like New York City changing the way that they're funding the police department to make sure that there's also funding for social services. And we've seen Minneapolis, where George Floyd's killing occurred, actually disband their police department. So we're seeing some reform. So it's not just people are talking about it, we're actually seeing some change. What does this mean for 2020? Well, Black Lives Matter has certainly changed the landscape of the 2020 presidential election, and we can see examples of this in both Donald Trump and Joe Biden's recent visits to Kenosha, Wisconsin. In Kenosha, Joe Biden met with a number of Black activists at a church and discussed his intention to address racial inequality. He said, essentially, I will go down fighting for racial inequality. So it was a pretty forceful appeal, and one that he might not have taken if not for the Black Lives Matter movement. On the other hand, Donald Trump has shifted his focus away from the economy and more on a law and order message. And so this, again, has been shaped by Black Lives Matter. His argument is that the Black Lives Matter generally, and these protests, are leading to a lot of destruction, and that he'll restore Black Lives Matter, restore law and order if he's elected. And so it's shaped the narrative of these campaigns, which will have dramatic impacts on who comes out to vote and who votes. So talking about that, people who protest go on to vote. Protesting is a costly activity, so people who protest generally go out to vote. So the fact that 1 in 10 Americans have protested, this is probably means that we're going to see higher levels of turnout than we've seen in the past. The narratives around Black Lives Matter lead to more targeted appeals, which in my recent research has shown should increase turnout amongst liberal whites, African Americans, and Latinxes. And so these targeted appeals will probably lead to a different type of electorate showing up in 2020 than in 2016. Given that both of these factors lead to higher levels of turnout, and that generally benefits the Democratic Party, BLM may help Biden. However, it's also possible that Donald Trump's campaign of law and order may persuade some non-college educated whites who had already been leaving the Democratic Party to be more supportive of his candidacy. And so in that way, may be useful for him. The other downside of going with the law and order profile is that it turns off suburban voters who the Republican Party needs to bring back to win in 2020. So either way, the Black Lives Matter movement is having a large effect on national politics. It's also having an effect on local politics here in Oregon. So Oregon, in some way, particularly Portland, is kind of the epicenter of the Black Lives Matter movement. They have protests for, I believe, over 100 consecutive days. And the federal government got involved with those protests during a period of time. So Donald Trump had a recent town hall meeting, and he discussed Oregon several times in that meeting. And so what does this mean for the local elections here in Oregon? Well, it really depends on where you live. If you live in a pretty liberal place, this is probably going to make it safer for the Democratic Party in those places. If you're in a conservative place, it's probably going to make it safer for the Republican Party. As a state overall, though, the groups that I mentioned, which will be most mobilized by Black Lives Matter, liberal whites, Latinxes, in some ways African Americans, that's probably going to benefit the Democratic Party in large part because Oregon has been a destination state where people are moving into the state, and people who generally move into a different place tend to be much more liberal. And so in this way, statewide, the BLM may actually may benefit the Democratic Party statewide. I guess that is my time. If I have a quick second, I'd like to plug. I have a book that came out on Tuesday, The Case for Identity Politics, Polarization, Demographic Change, and Racial Appeals. And I'm also on Twitter at Christoph. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Chris, for your insights on the impacts of social movements, on recent elections, on anticipating on this coming election, but also thank you so much for your work on bringing attention to racial inequality and helping us better understand those dynamics. And now we'll go on to an overview of voting in Oregon on local election, also local election trends from Deschutes County Clerk, Nancy Blankenship. Nancy's presentation is pre-recorded. And now for an overview of voting in Oregon and election trends in Central Oregon from Deschutes County Clerk, Nancy Blankenship. Please note that Nancy's presentation is pre-recorded and she will not be available for audience questions. Nancy.
Thank you, Jamie. Oregon has a long history of vote by mail. It started in 1981 with Lynn County Clerk Dale Riley going to San Diego County and working elbow to elbow with the staff there to learn how to do vote by mail. So the first vote by mail election was that November of 1981 in Lynn County, and I believe they shared a district with one of the surrounding counties. And so that was the advent of our vote by mail. And over the next number of years, we were able to persuade the legislature to allow special districts elections to be included in vote by mail. And then in 1998, by overwhelming 2/3 vote, the citizens of Oregon voted for all vote by mail. So in the year 2000, Oregon had every election vote by mail. So a presidential, primary and general, and we were very successful at that. So vote by mail has been something that we've been doing for over 20 years, and it's been successful. We've been learning, we've been changing, we've been growing our vote by mail process every year as we go to the legislature and ask for fixes, and we make changes by adding like secrecy envelopes back in the past, and just a variety of things that we work together with the Secretary of State's office and the county clerks and the Secretary of State, presenting ideas that we can make a more unified and better experience for our voters. And so that's kind of the basics of where vote by mail came from. Oregon is the first vote by mail state, with Washington that followed second, and then Colorado. Each of us has a different flavor of vote by mail. And as an Oregon election official, we think ours is the best, of course. And so in the 3-county area, we have been seeing a tremendous growth in our population. For example, when automatic voter registration started January 1st of 2016, Deschutes County was just under 103,000. Clerk County was just under 13,000, and Jefferson County was just over 10,000. Let's fast forward to end of July 2020, compare just under 103,000 to over 144,000. That's a 40% impact or increase for Deschutes County. Clerk County was just under 13,000, and they're at about 18,500. That's a 45% increase. And Jefferson County was just over 10,000 and are now at 15,700. So that's a 53% increase in registration. So that's a huge influx over the last 4 years. A lot of that has to do with the Oregon motor voter. When you go into register to get a driver's license or an ID or a permit, you're automatically registered to vote. You are given 21 days to opt out of that after receiving a letter from the Secretary of State giving you that information, and also telling you that if you would like to register with one of the parties, you could do so as well. Otherwise, you'll be registered as a non-affiliated. So that all happened since in January of 2016. That was an impetus for the growth, as well as we've seen a lot of people moving to Central Oregon. Voter turnout expectations for November. Based on our historical turnout for a presidential election, and I think it's going to be on the high end this year, we're looking at anywhere from 83 to 87%. Clerk County is looking at 80 to 84%, and Jefferson County is looking at about 80% for a presidential election. Oregon has always been in the top 3 to 5 states as far as voter turnout, so we're expecting that will continue to be at the top as far as turnout as well. One of the things that has been of interest is youth voting and what the statistics are for that. So their participation in local elections is pretty dismal. So, but in a presidential election at the primary, they're about 20%. And then for a presidential general, they're about 51 to 58%. So that's good. But for a governor, it drops down for the primary to about 10%, and for the governor's race at a general election is about 40%. And what you see in trend, and I think that trend's probably held over time, is that as people grow older, more seasoned, we become more interested in our world around us, and want to participate, see the value of participation. For those of you that are new to Central Oregon, one of the best examples I have of one vote does make a difference was in 2020 or 2010. The city of Bend had a race where there was 2 votes difference, 30,000 participation, and there's 2 votes difference. So, you know, we do have great examples locally as well as nationally and in the world of where one vote does make a difference. So it's important to encourage everyone to participate, because that one vote could make a difference either way for those candidates in that City of Bend election. And I have more recent statistics, but that's probably the most dramatic, where you have a 30,000 people participating and there's only 2 votes difference on one race. One of the things that we always see, again, related to youth and people moving to Oregon, especially Central Oregon, is inexperienced voters. It's been interesting. I've never had so many people ask to help me on an election. Over 17 and a half years I've been here, and I've probably fielded close to 60 to 70 calls, emails, in person, people wanting to help with, you know, at the polls on election day, and which we don't have. There's only 36 polling stations in Oregon, and that's the county clerk's office. But some of the things that I'd like to talk about a little bit is to overcome being an inexperienced voter. And so one of the things is Oregon does a voter pamphlet, and for every primary and general election, the Secretary of State's office produces that. And also Deschutes County does a voter's pamphlet for every election. We're only one of maybe 9 to 12 different counties in the state that produces a voter's pamphlet. So yay, Deschutes County. Thanks for funding us for that. So those are mailed out 1 week prior to when ballots go out, so you can start your education early. If you're really a go-getter, you can go online the end of the month, and our voters pamphlet will be online, as well as the Secretary of State will have their voters pamphlet on their website as well. So do your research, know what you're going to do when you get that ballot, and return it back.
Nancy's full interview is available online at cityclubco.org. Across our state and country, people are asking how we can engage more voters, especially from demographics with lower voter turnout. Well, it starts with listening. And we are very fortunate to have with us McLeod Parker, our final panelist, to share her personal experience and insights on how she became a more engaged voter. McLeod.
Hello. I am a 24-year-old activist, a newer activist here in Bend, Oregon, one of the few who's been born and raised here. And I'd like to say, from my own perspective, I was born with a little bit of Bend privilege, meaning I wasn't worried about crime. There wasn't, a press for conversation in my own home about who had power in our city or in the White House, for that matter. Coming from a safer community, that was one aspect. Another aspect was I was actually raised a Jehovah's Witness. So Jehovah's Witnesses do not vote, and they don't really discuss politics at home. And one thing that you want to remember is, even if there's not a lot of people out there voting, since there's some religions that don't, a lot of people still share your same views and beliefs. So don't let that be discouraging. Another factor as to why I wasn't raised with the pressing matter of voting and having my voice being heard was it wasn't really implemented into me in my schooling. In the 9 different public schools that I went to here in Central Oregon, I cannot say in the structure that we were set to be prepared for society. I don't think I left that structure prepared for society. There are a lot of covered topics that are brushed over in government. We learn about the 3 branches, Senate, House, etc. There are many things that I feel like we should also be learning in terms of our own community. So, for example, our own policies here within Deschutes County, things that will be immediately affecting us when we are out of high school. Now, when I'm in high school, we have a dress code, we have attendance policies, and we have free lunch for whoever's eligible. We don't personally vote on these things as kids in school, but we adhere to them and we conform. So when we're 17 years old and we're still young children, like basically coming out of school, we feel unprepared because we know that we have to conform and mandate to these policies that we did not vote on and we didn't choose. So we have to make sure that we are having these discussions more on a local, smaller level about what our impact can be for when we are released into society, to be more prepared. There are things such as zoning, housing, rent caps, things that can be voted on, budgets, what's going into community resources versus going into. I'm not sure I understand. Apologies, versus going into your police force. So there's things that you want to make sure that you're educated on. And there's also things that you want to make sure are available for you. So when you're in school, for example, again, if I'm being discriminated against, I know that I can go to my counselor, my teacher, and I can report that. But if I'm walking down the streets here in Bend, I'm not sure who I might be able to go to. So this is now on me to make sure that I'm being an educated person and making sure I'm aware of who's forming committees, who's focusing on equity, diversion, and inclusivity within our own city council, and making sure that I'm focusing small for people who are going to have my back in my city, that are going to assist my future. A lot of people think that one vote, one person may not really count, and that's what I felt for a while growing up, especially when you see things like the Electoral College. Hillary Clinton, she won popular vote, but Donald Trump continued to win the Electoral College, taking the White House. And that can be a little disheartening, but we have to remember that just because we didn't get the president that we wanted, it doesn't mean that we can't get the city officials or get the sheriff that we want to vote in, and make sure that we have those city officials who have our back. And as youth, we need to realize that there's a lot more power that we have in paying attention to our vote. One thing that the youth need to remember is that we have social media as a huge tool and power for these platforms. Not only are all these politicians going to have platforms, but a quick Google search for every name that you're going to be putting down on those ballots is going to mean a lot, so you don't give your power to somebody who's going to use it wrongfully. This is also going to give us the opportunity to have more discussions online on a level head. We want to make sure we're being as unbiased as possible, because if we can't have constructive conversations and understand both parties' views, beliefs, and wants, then we're not going to be able to compromise and come to a democracy that we really need and we deserve. So we need to make sure that we're being able to listen and learn and understand that maybe you voted down a party line once before, and that was a mistake, and now we're going to move forward, we're going to grow together, and we're going to research and educate ourselves on the people that we're voting for. There's a lot of power in an educated vote, and you might also find that there's people on your ballot who are BIPOC, who are LGBTQ+. People, we have that opportunity for our city council here in Bend to get seats filled who are going to include diversity for us. So you want to pay attention and make sure your votes are going down for their names specifically. This is a marathon, not a sprint. So we have to remember, by starting small and getting these people in these smaller seats, they're going to be the ones who are going to become your mayors and run for governor. And they're going to be the ones making noise when you need noise to be made. Going back into seeing people of color in power, I never saw anybody in power of color here in Bend. I went through my entire schooling here, and not once have I ever had a Black teacher. Not once have I ever had a Latinx teacher. There's been no people of color in power in my life. So it's hard for me as a young woman to grow up and see myself in those roles if I didn't see that. So a quick statistic, a Black child is 13% more likely to go to college if they have a Black teacher by the 3rd grade. And if they have 2 Black teachers by the 3rd grade, they're 32% more likely to go to college. So we need to make sure that we are giving our future and our kids people to look up for as well, and look up to. So that way we're filling those seats with people who are going to, once again, have our backs, look like us, understand us, and speak our language. With these civil rights movements, I absolutely believe that they have greatly impacted the view that the youth and the BIPOC community have in their power here. Like Chris was mentioning earlier, there are 1 in 10 people who have been out protesting for Black Lives Matter in America recently, and they're more likely to go out and vote. For example, in Portland, I've been at those peaceful protests that have turned violent due to police brutality. And there are 4 rounded demands for, pardon me, for Portland right now. And one of them being the resignation of Mayor Ted Wheeler. He has not met that demand. He is still in office. So I absolutely believe that there is going to be a huge increase of youth and BIPOC voters who have been out protesting, knowing that their demand isn't being met. So they're going to ensure that that demand is being met by being out and voting, because we are all fed up with the systemic oppression, with the constant injustices that we're seeing every single day. Even in all around us, we are seeing negativity and violence, and we need to understand that by sitting idly and thinking that our vote doesn't matter is just helping us dig a hole a little bit deeper. So we want to make sure that we are communicating, we are listening, and we are learning. One of the biggest things to circle back on is the use of social media, because you can vet your politicians. You find their name, most likely they're going to have a Twitter handle. A lot of the times you'll be able to tweet at a politician, and sometimes you can get a response back, and you can get some background and some history on those politicians. Not only that, you can get some history on your own city and your state. For example, I didn't realize it was illegal to be Black until 1926 here in Oregon, until this year. Social media is a great tool. You're going to learn more from that than you will from Fox News, I'll bet you that. So make sure we are using all of the resources we can. We are continuing to be educated and conversing with one another. We cannot let this moment for change pass us by. So please get out and vote.
Mylea, thank you so much. I'm supposed to like smoothly move on to the next time and say we're on to Q&A, but I just thank you for your powerful words. Thank you for the wisdom you've shared for all of us as voters. The advice you share applies to all of us. But thank you especially for talking about your personal experience with transitioning to being a more engaged voter and why, and building our understanding. So I just want to say thank you so much. Now we'll go on to Q&A, our Q&A session, and we're just going to start this because the conversation with Nancy was pre-recorded. We're going to start with a couple pre-recorded questions for Nancy, and then we'll be back for Chris and Mylea. Nancy, can you describe what happens to our ballot once you receive it?
So we get ballots, we put them in mail trays that we use from the Postal Service. It goes through this machine and it sorts it out by precinct. During that time, it also captures the signature side of the envelope. We use that signature to compare to the signature that we have on file in the voter's record, and we compare that signature to make sure it matches. We're not looking whether it says Jim Allen Smith. We're looking at the style of how Jim Smith signs his name. Does he use a large capital J? What is the slant? Is it loopy, straight, small? What is the characteristics of his signature? That's what we're looking at. And so if the ballot is a signature is a match, it moves forward and it goes to the election board to be processed. And what I mean by that is it's taken out of the envelope, flattened so that it's prepared to go through the scanner. If the voter signature doesn't match, or the voter forgot to sign their envelope, then the voters are notified. So with a no signature, we send them a postcard because it's easy to kind of flip over, and we hope we'll get more of their attention to come in and cure what we call cure that signature, which is to provide us a signature. And they can also do that with a card that we have if they can't come into our office. If their signature just doesn't match, we send them a letter with a voter registration card copied on the back so that they can return that signature. And so that when they return that back to us, we'll compare that to the signature on the ballot return envelope, and hopefully it'll match, and we can move that ballot forward to be counted. So that's kind of the life cycle of the ballot at the front end. On the election side of the board, this side of the House, they are extracting the ballots from the outer return envelope and the secrecy sleeve. If people decide to use those are optional, not required, and preparing them to go through the scanner. We've got 3 scanners that we use to scan the ballots, and it's a software that identifies what oval has been marked and what that vote is for. And so then after 8 p.m. on election night, we can pull all that together and provide our first let of results for the community.
Thank you, Nancy, for that, information. There's more questions from Nancy on the website, cityclubco.org. And now let's turn over to our other 2 panelists. Chris, let me start with you. You mentioned, and Leah also mentioned, some of the protests going on, including those in Portland. Some of the protests have been peaceful, some have included violence. And that includes violence from protesters, from counter-protesters, and also those trying to control the violence, including police. So I want to ask 2 parts to this question. For violence associated with protesters, what impacts do rioters have on the protests that are intended by their organizers to be peaceful? My follow-up is going to be for violence associated with those controlling the protest. What impacts do vigilantes or state-sanctioned actors have on democracy and our free speech?
Yeah, I guess to the first question, I mean, the protests, as Mylea pointed out, are overwhelmingly peaceful, right? And this is true across the United States. I think the media and people in general are interested in violence, right? So even if there's like 1 or 2%, certainly probably even less than that, like 0.1% are violent, that gets that gets more attention than others. The impact that it has is kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brings more attention to the movement. And there's some research that shows that cities then put more resources into, if there was a riot, then cities put more resources into those cities. The downside is that when they put in more resources, they also tamp down on control, right? So then they just increases it. So if the goal is to lessen the police state, this violence just increases it. And I think, as you mentioned, one of the responses to any of the violence that's occurring in Portland is kind of counter violence from state sanctioned actors and vigilantes. that doesn't do much to tamp down on the protests, right? I think Trump sending in federal troops probably mobilized individuals to become more involved in a way that they might not have otherwise been.
You're muted, Jamie.
Oops, thank you. Sorry about that. The classic moderator mistake of having being muted. Thank you, Chris, for that comment. And turning it over to you now, Malia. You mentioned in your comments about your own experience in school and how civics education differs from actually preparing you to be an active member of your community. But the question that came in was specific to your comment about the number of BIPOC educators here in Central Oregon. What advice or what would you do to change the number of BIPOC educators in Central Oregon? And actually, I'm going to start out by asking you to remind our viewers what BIPOC stands for, and then to go on from there to your advice on how we can change the current numbers and dynamics so that we can get to that point you raised about more young students of color having the experience that you mentioned.
Absolutely. As a reminder, BIPOC being a Black, Indigenous person of color. Now, what I think is going to be the biggest factor in allowing us to have more of, pardon me, more of an influence with our Black community here in town. I do think time is going to be one of the biggest factors. With the statistic of, Black people being illegal here until 1926, me growing up here, 20 years ago, it was very, very far and few between that I saw anybody who looked anything like me. And now I see those numbers slowly increasing as we are becoming more progressive and growing here in Bend. Now, I don't know if that's going to mean that we're going to have teachers of color immediately moving here just because we are being progressive. But I do think that one thing that we could do is, once again, using social media and all of our platforms that we have. There are a lot of great influences around America that may not just be within your city that you can definitely have your children look up to, making sure they have a role model and continuously, speaking about them being able to have an impact, telling your child they can be the president one day, no matter what they look like. Definitely just having those conversations at home, because I don't think that there's anything immediately that we can change about having Black people come to Bend and have a great influence. But in time, it's happening. Absolutely.
Thank you. That's such a great observation. I remember as a planner years ago going into a council meeting and being right behind a small kid who grabbed his mom's skirt and pointed at the dais and said, Mom, he looks like me. And he was pointing at an Asian American council member. And that sense of who we can become is such a powerful thing. Chris, back to you, and just a short little follow-up to your presentation, and then I'll ask a longer question. On the question is the 1 in 10 statistic that you gave of people who protested, is that only for Black Lives Matter protests or for all protests?
That's only for Black Lives Matter. So 1 in 5 protested in all protests, if you can count. And that's probably a lot higher now. If you count the Women's March, March for Our Lives, and other protests that occurred, it's closer to probably 1 in 5, maybe 1 in 4. These are numbers you haven't seen since the 1960s.
That's incredible. Thank you. And then the longer question, do you think that many of the political divisions that we're hearing and the anger and some of the conversations, let's say, we're seeing at protests are more disagreements about identity politics or political philosophies on how public resources should be spent?
So I might have a bias in this answer, but my bias would be that it's driven a lot by identity politics, right? So I think that people couch their views of identity politics in some type of political philosophy as a way to kind of not appear as being racially biased. But there's a lot of research that shows that underneath all of it is largely identity politics. I think it's largely a misunderstanding that if there's a group that's fighting for one identity, that comes at a net loss for myself. And that's not the case, right? Ending police brutality benefits everybody, right? Making the street safer benefits everybody. But I think yeah, I think it's tied to that, to racial politics in some ways.
Thank you. Malia, back to you. What do you suggest needs to be done to get more young people to vote during the primaries, but also in the general election? And not just in presidentials, but also in what's called off-year election or midterm elections. What are some of the ways to engage more voters?
I think one great piece that's come about with these civil rights movements recently is community organizers and activist movements here within each community. I do know that there's been a great amount of talk about making sure you are registered to vote, that you're going to be there. Do not, miss any deadlines. There's been a lot of talk on social media, which has been a great resource again, especially with anybody displaced in the wildfires, trying to make sure that they have access to make sure they re-register at a different address to make sure they're counted as well. Most definitely, not only continuously talking about it, but talking about it on every platform and every level, from the home at a young age, like I mentioned, the classroom, being unbiased, being able to talk about it with your peers and not feel judgment, being able to have those comfortable conversations. And then I really do think influencers, unfortunately, have a lot of influence on the youth nowadays with how the internet has become. And so the more that we can use the larger platforms to speak about these things, the more people will be easily influenced. It's the way it is. And I do think that the right people talking about it, like the NBA using their stadiums for voting, that is going to be huge for youth, BIPOC youth especially, to see that something that they've loved and followed for so long cares about this, so I should care too. So the right platforms, definitely.
Great point. And thanks for that very important reminder that any Oregonians who have been displaced by the fires, make sure that you register. You can use another address to receive your ballot, but you do have to register that with the Secretary of State by the deadline. We can all make sure we check and verify that we're registered to vote and up to date. So thank you for that reminder. Chris, back to you. Is there public opinion data on abolishing the Electoral College? Malia mentioned it. I know it's been a subject of conversation for several years. And is there, do you have information on what the average American view is on the Electoral College process?
Yeah, so it's funny. The vast majority of Americans before 2000 wanted to abolish the Electoral College. After 2000, then you started to see a partisan divide that then has just blown up after 2016, where Democrats have become much, much more likely to want to abolish the Electoral College, and Republicans have become much, much less likely to abolish the Electoral College. So the average person wants to see it abolished because there are more Democrats wanting it and fewer Republicans not wanting it, but there's a big partisan divide. I haven't seen data looking at small states versus large states, but my guess is that if you're from a smaller state where your vote has a disproportionate impact, you're probably also going to be you're not going to want to see changes to the Electoral College.
Thank you. Malia, back to you. You talked about the powerful shaping of identity and personal experience, both in terms of being a BIPOC person here in Central Oregon, and then also being raised in a family that was very focused on their faith, and that how some faiths discourage getting involved in elections. You talked about your own personal experience, but can you provide some additional advice to for those who might be listening, some of your peers especially, on how steps they could take to engage in deciding the leaders that make decisions for our lives?
I think that coming from a religious standpoint as an adolescent, it can be a little hard to have your own voice. I do think that turning 18, having that adult mentality and being able to remove yourself, essentially the separation of church and state, is exactly what we would hope for in this manner. I do think that when I was younger, I used the sense ignorance isn't bliss, because when I was young and ignorant, I thought that everything was great, but I didn't realize that I needed to be making those those impacts, definitely. So I think that I would, pardon me, I did lose exactly what I was going to say. Do you mind repeating that one more time for me? I'm so sorry.
It's more.
And Jamie, I'm having a hard time hearing you. I am. I just now started to hear you again, unfortunately. I did not catch anything that you had just said.
Well, sorry, I apologize on that. And it might be part of the internet access that we're having, especially I'm here in rural Oregon. Let's say this. There's a bunch of other questions that have come in. So both for Mylea and Chris, if you don't mind, if we could send you the questions that have come in, and if you have thoughts that you'd like to share, we can get those on the website so we can make sure we're responding to questions and also really tapping into the great insights and expertise you both have. So with that, we are running tight on time. I want to thank all of our speakers, Dr. Chris Stout, Nancy Blankenship, and Mylea Parker. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to participate in today's program. My name is Jamie McLeod-Skinner. It's been my honor to moderate this forum. Civic engagement is essential to a healthy democracy. And to that end, City Club is partnering with the League of Women Voters of Deschutes County to bring you a series of 11 candidate forums for positions that will be on the ballot of Central Oregonians this upcoming election. The forums will take place in the evenings at 7 p.m. Beginning on September 22nd. And there's more information on the City Club website, which is cityclubco.org. Please check it out, and please join us for those and become an empowered and, as Mylea advised us, educated voter as well. City Club is going to be changing things up in October. Instead of our traditional forum, we'll be providing a series of brief interviews. And that's because Bend has recently reached a milestone. The US Census has estimated that Bend's population surpassed 100,000 last year. So our topic for October is Bend at 100K. So there'll be interviews of city leaders and experts in various disciplines to talk about this, this change, asking their observations on changes in the past 10 years and what they anticipate changes will be in the next 10. If you've enjoyed today's forum and the City Club's ongoing efforts to engage Central Oregonians in building community, then please consider becoming a member or live stream sponsor to help cover these costs. You can go to cityclubco.org for more information. Thank you for watching. Please continue to cultivate conversations about issues that connect us all to build a stronger and healthier community. And don't forget to vote. Thank you.